The Pacific Ocean, roughly 2,000 miles west of South America. November 20th, 1820. A first mate named Owen Chase is standing on the deck of an American whale ship called the Essex when he sees something that no sailor in recorded history had ever reported before. An enormous bull sperm whale, around 85 feet long, the length of the ship itself, stops swimming, turns, and faces the vessel head-on. And then it charges. It rams the Essex with its entire body. The impact throws men off their feet. The ship shudders like it hit a reef. And while the crew is still trying to understand what just happened, the whale circles back, builds up speed, and does it again. Harder this time, deliberately, aiming for the bow. The second blow staves in the hull. The Essex begins to sink. 20 men are now stranded in 3 small open boats in the middle of the largest ocean on Earth, thousands of miles from the nearest coast. What follows over the next 3 months is one of the most horrifying survival stories in maritime history. Starvation, dehydration, and eventually the survivors drawing lots to decide who would be eaten so the others could live. 3 years later, a young sailor would hear this story secondhand, and 30 years after that, he'd turn it into a novel called Moby Dick. Now, here's the question you should be asking. What were these men doing out there in the first place? Why sail a wooden ship for 3 years to the far side of the planet to hunt the largest predator on Earth by hand with sharpened iron from a rowboat? For oil. Specifically, for the oil inside that whale's head. And here's the part that should genuinely stop you. That oil, the substance those 20 men were literally dying for, was, in 1820, one of the most valuable liquids on the entire planet. It lit the street lamps of London and Boston. It lubricated the machines of the Industrial Revolution. It made the fortunes that built entire American cities from nothing. And today, you cannot legally buy it. Most people have never heard of it. And the last time it touched the average human life, it was quietly being churned into margarine and pressed into a bar of soap. So how does a substance go from being worth more than almost anything on Earth, a thing that men crossed oceans and died for, that made one small town the richest place in the world, to something so forgotten that we replaced it and then pretended it never existed? That's the whole story. Let's start at the beginning. Human beings have been killing whales for a very long time, but for most of that history, it was opportunistic. A whale washes up dead on a beach, a coastal village strips it, and that's it. The animal was too big, too fast, and too dangerous to hunt on purpose with the tools people had. The first people to turn whaling into a real, organized commercial industry were the Basques, the seafaring people of the coast between Spain and France, along the Bay of Biscay. By around the 11th century, Basque fishermen had figured out how to systematically hunt a species called the right whale, and the name tells you everything. They called it the right whale because it was the right whale to hunt. It was slow, it stayed close to shore, and crucially, when you killed it, it floated, so you could actually tow the carcass back instead of watching your prize sink to the bottom. Every other whale was the wrong whale. This one was the right one. What the Basques wanted from it was 2 things. First, the blubber, the thick layer of fat that they'd cut off and boil down into oil for lamps and soap. And second, the baleen. That's the long, flexible, comb-like plates in the whale's mouth that it uses to filter food. Baleen was strong, springy, and could be shaped when heated. Think of it as the plastic of the medieval world, one of the only naturally flexible, moldable materials available before industrial chemistry existed. For 400 years, the Basques essentially owned this trade. They hunted out the Bay of Biscay, then sailed further and further, to Iceland, to Newfoundland, following the whales across the North Atlantic. and they guarded their techniques the way every monopoly in history guards its secrets. How to spot a whale, how to approach it, how to render the fat, how to preserve the oil for a long voyage. This was proprietary knowledge, and it made the Basque Coast wealthy. But whale oil in this era was still a regional business. Valuable, yes, but it hadn't yet become the substance that would light half the world. For that, you needed a different whale, a different ocean, and a very specific problem that humanity was about to run into. The problem was darkness. For all of human history up to this point, the night was genuinely dark. When the sun went down, your options were fire, tallow candles made from rendered animal fat, which were smoky, smelly, and dim, or beeswax candles, which burned clean and bright, but were so expensive that only the rich and the church could afford them. The vast majority of human beings, for the vast majority of history, simply went to sleep when it got dark because light was a luxury. And then somebody figured out what was inside the head of a sperm whale. The sperm whale is not like the slow, coastal right whale. It's a deep-diving, fast-moving apex predator that hunts giant squid thousands of feet down in the open ocean. And inside its enormous, boxy head is a chamber filled with a waxy, semi-liquid substance that early whalers completely misunderstood. They thought it was the animal's semen. That's not a joke. That is literally why it's called a sperm whale, and why the substance is called spermaceti, from the Latin for whale seed. They were wrong about what it was, but they were very, very right about what it could do. Spermaceti, when you refined it, produced the finest artificial light the world had ever seen. Candles made from it burned brighter, cleaner, and steadier than anything else. No smoke, no foul smell, a clear white flame. In fact, the light from a spermaceti candle became so standardized that for over a century, the scientific unit for measuring the brightness of any light source was defined by it. We called it candle power. The next time you see that word on a flashlight, remember, it was originally defined by the glow of a burning piece of whale. And beyond the spermaceti in the head, the sperm whale's blubber produced a superb lamp oil, and occasionally its digestive system produced something even stranger: ambergris. Ambergris is a waxy substance that forms in the whale's gut, gets expelled, and floats on the ocean for years, curing in salt and sun. It became the most prized fixative in the perfume industry, and gram for gram, it could be worth more than gold. People have literally found lumps of whale intestinal secretion on a beach and become wealthy overnight. That's still true today. So now you have the setup. A single animal that produces the best light source on Earth, the best industrial lubricant available, a flexible construction material, and occasionally a substance worth more than gold. There was no more valuable creature in the world. The only problem was catching it. And that problem is where the money and the death came in. The nation that turned sperm whaling into an empire wasn't Spain or Britain or France. It was a tiny, sandy, wind-scoured island off the coast of Massachusetts called Nantucket. Nantucket had terrible soil. You couldn't really farm it. What it had was a location right at the edge of the deep Atlantic, and a community, many of them Quakers, who were disciplined, patient, and utterly relentless. By the early 1700s, Nantucketers had started sailing out to hunt sperm whales in the open ocean, and they discovered something that changed the entire economics of the industry. They learned to render the oil on board the ship. This sounds like a small technical detail. It was actually the whole game. Earlier, whalers had to kill a whale and rush the carcass back to shore before it rotted, which limited how far you could hunt. But the Nantucketers built brick furnaces right on the deck of the ship, called the tryworks, where they could boil the blubber down into clean oil in barrels at sea, thousands of miles from home. A whale ship became a floating factory, and that meant the hunting grounds were now limitless. If the whales moved, you followed them, around Cape Horn, into the Pacific, across to Japan, into the Arctic. A whaling voyage stopped being a trip and became an expedition. 3, sometimes 4 years at sea. A crew leaving as young men and coming home aged, chasing a moving target across the entire globe. Think about the economics of that for a second. You outfit a ship, you hire 30 men, you sail for 3 years, and you have no idea if you'll come back with a fortune or with nothing. It was the venture capital of its age, enormous risk, catastrophic downside, and a payoff so large it built dynasties. And when the money came in, it flowed to one place above all others: New Bedford, Massachusetts. If you want to understand how much money was in whale oil, understand this. By the middle of the 19th century, New Bedford, a small port city you have almost certainly never thought about, was, by some measures, the richest city per capita in the world. Not the richest in America. In the world. The wealth pouring out of these whales built mansions, banks, churches, and a merchant aristocracy whose fortunes rivaled anything in Europe. They called New Bedford the city that lit the world, and they were not exaggerating. The lamps burning in London, in Paris, in the parlors of the growing American middle class, a huge share of that light was being pulled out of the Pacific Ocean by New England sailors, one whale at a time. At its peak, around 1846, the American whaling fleet numbered more than 700 ships. That was the overwhelming majority of the entire world's whaling fleet, operating out of a handful of little New England ports. A single successful sperm whale could yield anywhere from 25 to over 40 barrels of oil, and a full ship might return with 2,000–3,000 barrels, a cargo worth an absolute fortune. And if you're finding this fascinating, this whole hidden history of how a forgotten industry lit the entire world before electricity existed, do consider subscribing, because this channel is built entirely on stories exactly like this one. The ordinary things around you that turn out to have blood, empires, and lost fortunes buried inside them. Now, that fortune had a price, and the price was paid in human bodies. Whaling was, without exaggeration, one of the most dangerous jobs in human history. When a whale was spotted, the men didn't attack from the safety of the big ship. They lowered tiny wooden rowboats, whaleboats, barely bigger than a modern rowing shell, and rowed directly up to an animal that could weigh 50 tons. A man standing in the front would throw a harpoon by hand, not to kill the whale, but to attach the boat to it. And then came the part they called the Nantucket sleigh ride. The harpooned whale, terrified and enraged, would take off across the ocean, dragging the tiny boat and its crew behind it at tremendous speed. Men were pulled underwater. Boats were smashed to splinters by a single flick of the tail. Whales dove and dragged the line and everything attached to it into the depths. And sometimes, as the Essex learned, the whale simply decided to fight back and destroyed the ship outright. The men who signed up for this were often the desperate and the poor, young farm boys, immigrants, freed and escaped slaves, men with no other options, lured by the promise of a lay, a share of the final profit. But by the time the owners and captains and outfitters took their cuts, an ordinary sailor might spend 4 years at sea, risk death daily, and come home with almost nothing. The fortunes were real. They just didn't flow to the men in the boats. So the industry roared through the first half of the 19th century. New Bedford glittered. The whales died by the tens of thousands, and it seemed like it might go on forever. It didn't. And what killed it wasn't a war, or a treaty, or a whale. It was a hole in the ground in Pennsylvania. In 1859, in a town called Titusville, a man named Edwin Drake did something nobody had bothered to do at industrial scale before. He drilled a well specifically to find oil, not water, not brine, oil. And about 69 feet down, he struck it. Petroleum, pumped straight out of the earth. At first, this seems unrelated to whales, but refiners quickly learned to distill that crude petroleum into a product called kerosene. And kerosene did the one thing that whale oil did. It lit lamps. Except it did it cheaper. Much, much cheaper. You didn't need a 3-year expedition to the Pacific and a crew of men risking death. You needed a drill and a refinery. The oil came out of the ground on land, endlessly, for a fraction of the cost. The economics were merciless. Why pay a premium for light squeezed out of an animal at the far end of the world, when you could get the same light from a rock for a fraction of the price? The value of whale oil, the substance men had died for by the thousands, began to collapse, and history piled on. During the American Civil War in the 1860s, Confederate raiders deliberately hunted down and burned northern whale ships across the oceans, and the Union itself sank a fleet of old whalers full of stones to block a southern harbor, the so-called Stone Fleet. Dozens of vessels gone. Then came the final blow. In 1871, a fleet of 33 American whale ships pushed too far into the Arctic, chasing the last profitable grounds, and the ice closed in around them and crushed every single one. More than 1,200 people had to abandon ship and evacuate across the ice, miraculously without a single death. But the fleet was destroyed in a matter of days. The industry never recovered. The city that lit the world went dark. New Bedford's whaling fortunes faded into memory. The great fleets rotted at their moorings, and the men who knew how to render a whale on the deck of a ship at sea slowly died off, taking their trade with them. But here's the twist that most people don't know. The whales didn't get their reprieve. Not yet. Because in the 20th century, whaling came roaring back, bigger, faster, and infinitely more deadly than anything the men of Nantucket could have imagined. New technology changed everything. Steam and diesel ships that could outrun any whale, explosive harpoons fired from cannons, and enormous factory ships that could haul an entire whale up a ramp and process it whole, at sea, in hours. The hunt was no longer about lamp oil. Now whale oil was hardened through a chemical process called hydrogenation and turned into industrial fats, used in soap, in candles, and, unsettlingly, in margarine that people spread on their bread without any idea what was in it. Whale-derived glycerin even went into explosives. The animal that once lit the parlors of the world was now, invisibly, in the kitchen and the munitions factory. And the scale of this 20th century slaughter dwarfed everything before it. Where the Nantucketers killed whales in the tens of thousands over a century, the industrial fleets of the 20th century killed an estimated 3 million whales. Entire species were pushed to the very edge of extinction. The blue whale, the largest animal that has ever existed on this planet, larger than any dinosaur, was hunted from a population of around 250,000 down to a few thousand. We very nearly wiped out the biggest creature in the history of life on Earth to make soap and margarine. It took until 1986, within living memory, for the world to finally agree to a moratorium on commercial whaling and pull most of these species back from the brink. So where does that leave us? What's the legacy of all this? It's hiding everywhere, if you know where to look. It's in the word candle power, still stamped on flashlights, a fossil of a time when brightness itself was measured by burning whale. It's in the grand old mansions of New Bedford, monuments to a wealth nobody living remembers earning. It's in Moby Dick, the novel we still assign in schools, born from the true horror of the Essex. It's in the perfume on a department store shelf, some of which still lists ambergris, that strange treasure coughed up by a whale's gut. And it's in the very existence of the environmental movement, which arguably cut its teeth on the fight to save the whales. one of the first times humanity collectively decided that some things were worth more alive than dead. And there's a final, quiet irony sitting underneath the whole story. The thing that saved the whales, in the end, wasn't kindness. It was petroleum. It was Edwin Drake's hole in the ground. The moment fossil fuels made whale oil obsolete, the economic reason to hunt whales for light simply evaporated. We stopped slaughtering one species to the edge of extinction largely because we found a cheaper thing to burn, a thing that is now, in its own way, threatening the climate that every whale on Earth depends on. We didn't escape the pattern, we just moved it. So let's go back to where we started. A tiny boat on an endless ocean, a first mate watching an 85-foot animal turn and charge, 20 men about to lose everything for the oil inside a whale's head. They believed that oil was one of the most precious substances in the world, and for their brief moment in history, they were absolutely right. But the value was never really in the whale. It was in the darkness, in the simple, universal human hunger to push back the night. The whale just happened to be the most expensive way we ever found to do it. The moment something cheaper came along, the whole empire of oil and blood and fortune vanished so completely that most people today don't even know it existed. Here's the thing worth remembering. Almost nothing is valuable because of what it is. It's valuable because of what we need and what else we can get it from. Change either one, and the thing men died for by the thousands becomes a forgotten word on the side of a flashlight. The next time you flick on a light without thinking about it, that casual, effortless, endless light, remember that for most of human history, someone had to cross an ocean and kill a leviathan to give you a single clean flame. And we did it, gladly, for 200 years, until we didn't have to anymore.